You're listening to The Foundation of Wellness, a refreshing take on diet and lifestyle, with Jessica Dogert, a registered dietitian nutritionist, and Marisa Moon, a primal health coach. What's going on, everybody? This is Marisa Moon, and you're listening to the Foundation of Wellness podcast. I'm a primal health coach, and I teach intermittent fasting online to help adults figure out how intermittent fasting can actually set you free from dieting and help you just have a lifestyle that's totally intuitive with your eating plan and just put an end to dieting for good. You can find out more at marisamoon.com/ifreedom. Today, I have a guest on here that I really am proud to introduce to you. This is only going to be the second time we've even talked about the Autoimmune Protocol on this podcast, and we couldn't have found a better expert than Mickey Trescott. Mickey Trescott's a chef and certified nutritional therapy practitioner who helps people find creative solutions for cooking and succeeding on restrictive allergen-free diets, such as the Autoimmune Protocol, otherwise known as the AIP diet. You guys are going to hear me calling it that. Mickey is actually a former vegan and has an amazing story to share about her journey discovering that she had 2 autoimmune diseases and finding her way to recovery. And I'll let her tell you that whole story herself. I don't want her to hold back because it's incredible. And she's a leader in the community of the Autoimmune Paleo Protocol. She was blogging about this really before anybody knew about it. And her first book is called the Autoimmune Paleo Cookbook. It's won awards and become a national bestseller. She also runs a website called autoimmunewellness.com and a podcast called the Autoimmune Wellness Podcast, which, by the way, that's where I learned everything I know about autoimmune disease and the Autoimmune Protocol. Both of those she runs with her partner, Angie. And together they co-wrote a guidebook called the Autoimmune Wellness Handbook that helps you through so much more than diet, like how to be an informed patient and address all the other areas in your life that might be affecting your autoimmune condition. Now, Mickey and Angie teach and certify other healthcare practitioners to become AIP certified coaches. So needless to say, like I told you, Mickey is an absolute expert in the field of autoimmune wellness and dieting, and now she's blushing. Her new book just came out, and it's called The Nutrient-Densekitchen. I've had the pleasure to cook from and thumb through this book. It's amazing, loaded with over 100 recipes that focus on the AIP protocol, but the often overlooked vital element is that the food should be rich in nutrients so that you can support the healing process with great success. So, Mickey, I was so happy to give you this mega intro because I was blown away at everything that you're doing in this field. It's an absolute honor to have you on the Foundation of Wellness. Welcome to the show.
Oh my gosh, that was such an awesome introduction. Thank you, Marisa. I'm really excited to be talking to you today and to be chatting about AIP. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I am so grateful you are here. You know, I bet you've talked about this time and time again, but let's pretend like this is the first time anyone has heard about autoimmune disease and the Autoimmune Protocol. Get us a little overview on that and tell us about your story.
Okay, so those are a lot of topics. So first of all, autoimmune disease happens when our immune systems, which are designed to basically protect us from anything outside ourselves that could harm us, things like viruses and bacteria, different pathogens. So we kind of have this system that our body uses in order to manage that. With autoimmune disease, that system starts targeting our own tissues. So for me, I have Hashimoto's disease, which affects the thyroid. So my immune system attacks my thyroid. I also have celiac disease, and so it also attacks my small intestine. So with autoimmune disease, a lot of people are confused about why there are so many, why it isn't just called one big disease, but it's basically a collection of over 100 diseases that are linked by this immune system gone awry. So that's kind of the nutshell what autoimmune disease is. Now, AIP is a therapeutic diet and lifestyle intervention for people with autoimmune disease. And people are often confused why it works for so many diverse diseases. They're like, well, MS affects the brain, rheumatoid arthritis affects the joints. How can there be a diet or a template that works for all of these diverse conditions? And that's because the immune system resides in the gut. So we know that over 70% of it, home base is there. That's where it's interacting. And that's where what we put on our plate, we have a control over directly what goes into our guts and what interacts with our immune system. So that's like a super like 10,000 foot view of autoimmune disease and AIP. How I got into this, I was diagnosed with 2 autoimmune diseases 8 years ago. So like I mentioned, Hashimotos and celiac. I had been struggling for about a year with some, starting to be small symptoms, but then they just kind of trickled until it became like this flood where I had little things like neuropathies, loss of feeling in my fingertips, my hair started shedding, I started to have insomnia. I was 26 years old. I'd never really had any major health problems before. So all of these little things were kind of like, I guess that's what happens, when you get older, you start feeling more tired or you start not being able to sleep as much. But eventually I realized that I had a problem because my hands and feet were constantly cold. I was super irritable and grumpy all the time. And I went to my doctor just, for the first time, just saying, hey, all these little things are happening. And they said, oh, everything's fine. Fast forward 6 doctors later, and I had Googled at this point, I had realized that I was experiencing severe hypothyroidism symptoms. And I started asking for thyroid testing, and the doctors kept saying, well, you don't look like a thyroid patient. Like, you're in your 20s, you're thin, you appear healthy, like your thyroid labs are normal. We can't do anything to help you. This is all in your head. They offered me antidepressants. Many thyroid patients are used to this story. Yeah. But it wasn't until the 6th doctor that I had learned that there was autoimmune thyroid disease and that nobody had ever tested me for that. And when I went to this doctor and I asked for that test, they actually said, oh yeah, that could be a thing. And also we should test your celiac antibodies because those 2 diseases often go together. And they both came back positive. So I got a diagnosis of both of those diseases, but unfortunately, those diagnoses didn't do anything for me because that doctor also said, your thyroid is normal, you don't need medication, there's nothing we can tell you to do besides continue to eat gluten-free, which I had already discovered on my whole journey was something that I needed to do. So
wait a second, though. How does your thyroid look normal if you have Hashimoto's disease, which tell people what Hashimoto's disease is?
Yeah, so Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease that affects the thyroid. It is the most common autoimmune disease out there. And
wow.
I had positive antibodies, but my lab tests were in the conventional normal range. So like my TSH and, the total T3 and T4, which not to get too into lab work with you guys, but those tests are used by conventional doctors to diagnose hypothyroidism, but the range is really, really big. So when you actually dig in and do more specific tests like the free T3 and free T4 to actually look at the hormone levels, for someone like me, you could see my functional labs were off. And I actually ended up needing medication, but I didn't get it for like another year and a half after this point. So part of my journey with thyroid disease was just being undiagnosed, but then getting the diagnosis and then continuing to feel sick. And actually, after my diagnosis, I entered a period that was far worse than even before. So I started having neurological problems. I started slurring my speech, lost feeling on the left side of my face, had burning nerve pain up to my knees that kept me up at night. I mean, I had chest pain that was so bad. It was terrifying. I couldn't take a breath. I remember being in the bathtub trying to meditate. Okay, I feel like I could meditate through the pain if breathing didn't hurt. It was so depressing.
What were you thinking? Did you?
Honestly, I thought I was going to die. I kept going to see specialists and they kept saying, you are a, basket case, hypochondriac. And, maybe if we have these symptoms for 6 more months, we might be able to investigate another autoimmune disease like lupus or MS. And it was terrifying. So that rock bottom is really what inspired me to start thinking maybe my diet isn't helping me.
What kind
I
of
had been
diet were
vegan.
you eating? Oh,
So I was eating a gluten-free vegan diet, and I've got worse, And I asked every doctor, like, hey, like, does nutrition have anything to do with it? And they were like, oh no, you're eating this great low-fat diet. You're going to be fine. Like, it doesn't have anything to do with what you're experiencing. And the first couple doctors that told me that, I was like, okay, I'm reassured. Like, I really want to stay vegan. And then when I started getting sicker, I was like, I don't know. And I started Googling and researching like diet and autoimmune disease and, different things that I could try. And all the information that I found out there was about nutrient density and about inflammatory foods for autoimmune disease, which are like grains and legumes, and why you need certain nutrients that are in meat and animal foods. And that's what really inspired me to start introducing meat back in my diet and then do an elimination diet like AIP to figure out what food triggers I had.
and this was like all on your own. You were just on the internet trying to
Oh,
find
yeah.
answers.
And actually, how I started was I started by looking at success stories for vegans that had autoimmune disease, and I could not find one. And I'm
Whoa.
pretty good at the internet. Everybody in my family, like if they have something to like Google or like something to research, they like sick me on it because I'm pretty good at finding information. But I could not find any story. And actually, I found a website about people who were vegan who had started eating meat again because of their health problems and how they transformed their health. And I wouldn't say I was like, okay, I'm just going to do it because I was vegan for 10 years. I was really rooted in that approach, but I was so desperate and I decided that living my life that way wasn't worth it and that I would try some animal foods and see how I felt. And if I felt better, then I knew that that's what my body needed to heal. And that's exactly what happened.
You felt better right away, are you saying?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I ate red meat for the first time, and I mean, I had to have my husband cook it in a different room. Like I had to leave because I couldn't handle the smell. He had to like cook a little ground lamb in a bunch of vegetables so I couldn't see it. Like it was kind of hidden. And I ate like 3 or 4 bites. And then I went upstairs to be sick because every vegan thinks that that's what's going to happen if you haven't eaten meat in a long time. You're going to be sick. And I felt warm, like I felt good. My cheeks were pink and I took my body temperature because I was like, this is so weird. I haven't felt warm in so long. And my temperature was 97 degrees. And before that point, I was temping in like the 93 to 95 degree range normally. And my doctors were like, I mean, now knowing what I know, I'm like, if that isn't a sign of hypothyroidism, I don't know what is. But they were like, oh, some people run cold. But ever since I started eating red meat again, my temperature went back up. Like my body was functioning in a completely depleted state. And that experience made me realize like, okay, like this has something in it. I mean, all the B vitamins, like it's a thing, your body needs those nutrients. So my body definitely spoke to me that day. And, I had to do a lot of mental gymnastics and like really figuring out how I felt and what kind of meat I was going to eat. And that was a whole process. I don't want to minimize that, but, it was really transformative for me.
Wow. That's amazing. How did you decide to start sharing the autoimmune story and protocol as a blogger?
So when I was looking for all the vegan success stories, I noticed there were a lot of people sharing about their health stories online. And when I went through my illness, I feel like things are a little bit different now because awareness of chronic illness and autoimmune disease has expanded so much. Yeah. But like 8 years ago, it wasn't something that I really felt comfortable with as like a 20-something, even telling some of my more acquaintance-ish coworkers, friends, those type of people, like people that were really close to me, my really close family and friends, sure, they were very confused about it. They didn't know what it was. But I just had no one really to talk to about it, and nobody close to me had experienced anything close to what I had. And so I decided to start a blog. And I had a background as a chef, and I thought, well, I'm going to start a blog, and this is kind of an interesting way to cook. Nobody's doing recipes for it. So I might as well just like share some recipes and share my story and see if I can connect with some other people who are going through what I'm going through. And that's how the AIP movement started.
Wow, huge. You had such a huge role in that, and people were just waiting for somebody like you to start sharing those recipes. I mean, the diet, which we should talk about a little bit, the diet seems a little scary at first. You have to eliminate food groups that you always assumed were healthy. Talk to us a little bit about that, what it's like for someone when they're first approaching the autoimmune protocol.
Yeah, so the autoimmune protocol, it's more of a template or a process than a diet, because I think diet implies something that you're going to be on long term. And AIP is more of a process that someone can go through in order to identify a diet at the end that best supports their healing process. So in the beginning, I definitely thought of it as a diet because I came from vegan, and vegan is very much a diet. You have these rules and these restrictions, and you go continue on in the future with the same rules for as long as you're on it. AIP is different because if I'm doing AIP or you're doing AIP, that might look very different both in how we implement the protocol and then both in the diet that we end up on the other side. It's going to be unique to each of us. So it kind of is hard to describe that way. But the protocol, the elimination phase, is where you take out foods that are most likely to cause a problem for people with autoimmune disease. These are based in the research. So Dr. Sarah Ballantyne has written a book called The Paleo Approach with 2,000 scientific references. This isn't just, a bunch of guesses of foods that might be a problem for people with autoimmune disease. They actually have in the medical literature documented effects on intestinal permeability, gut flora imbalances, nutrient deficiencies, those types of things. So they're grains, legumes, nuts, eggs, dairy, and seeds, and nightshade family vegetables, and then any food product that is derived from any of those. So that's a lot of big, broad categories. A lot of people go, oh my gosh, what's left? But the first thing to know is that it's not forever. A lot of those foods are actually nutrient-dense foods that some people can reintroduce. So you're just taking them out for a certain period of time, maybe 1 to 3 months, and then reintroducing just to make sure that that food works for you. And then the second thing to know is that, the elimination phase is just really important for just clearing the slate with the immune system. And the immune system doesn't forget things. That's why autoimmune disease isn't technically curable, because once the immune system starts to attack a certain tissue in our body, we don't have any way to kind of train it to stop doing that. And it's the same way about food. When we start to eat a food that we're sensitive to, if we're eating a lot of foods we're sensitive to all the time, it's really hard to tell because our bodies are inflamed all the time. We have all these symptoms, but once we clear that slate and the immune system just has a little bit of time to just like modulate and balance and calm down, then when we introduce one specific thing, not in the presence of anything else, you can see exactly how the body reacts to it. So that 100% is really important. I know a lot of people are, for balance, for mental health, like 80-20, that type of approach, I think is really great for long-term for a lot of people. But for AIP, it is actually technically important to do the elimination diet, 100% compliance for a very short period of time. Yeah. Now, two other things about AIP that a lot of people forget about is one, nutrient density. Eliminations are only half of the equation. Part of eliminating all those foods is then what you add in, and we add in extra nutrient dense foods because they provide the raw materials for our bodies to heal. So these are things like organ meats, bone broth, colorful fruits and vegetables, cold water fatty fish, shellfish, grass-fed or pasture-raised meats, fermented foods. It is possible to technically do an elimination diet where you're just eating chicken breast, broccoli, and coconut oil over and over 3 meals a day. And that is not nourishing your body. That is not getting someone back up to nutrient status as quickly as possible. People really need to be introducing those extra nutrient-dense foods into their diet. And then once someone's been on the elimination phase for like 1 to 3 months and they've experienced progress, ideally, they can start reintroducing foods. So you start incorporating foods from least likely to cause a problem and most nutrient dense. So these are things like legumes with edible pods, egg yolks, ghee. These are nutrient dense foods. They're foods that have things that we want to incorporate into our diet if they don't affect us. And so we start with those foods, and then you go down a list into the things that are harder to reintroduce for people. So some of the more, harder to digest, gluten-free still grains. Some of those can be hard for people. Some of the nightshade family foods like tomatoes and peppers can be hard. Alcohol in high quantities, that's going to be hard for anyone, regardless of having an autoimmune disease. But you start to build that diet, and the reintroduction process is really where it becomes completely tailored. And then that experience as an autoimmune patient, learning how to manage this lifelong illness, you can ebb and flow through the phases of your life where when you're not feeling well, you can be a little stricter with your diet. You can add in more of those nutrient dense foods. When things are good, you can unfurl the sails. You can let things go a little bit. You can introduce some foods that are more borderline for you in the name of having a good experience or connecting with people or traveling. So that's a long description, but the AIP.
There's plenty to say. I mean, you've brought up so many important points, but I really want to ask you, what are some of the signs that you tell people to look for when they're reintroducing foods if everyone has different autoimmune conditions?
Totally. So the easiest thing is when the food causes a symptom that went away during the protocol. Of course, if you have psoriasis and you have a rash on your arm and then you do AIP and the rash goes away and then you reintroduce egg yolks and the rash comes back, then the egg yolk is going to cause a rash for you. That is ideal. And I think what a lot of people are looking for when they do AIP, but unfortunately, that's not always how it works. So other than your symptoms that have already gone away, the biggest thing that I tell people to look for are actually digestive changes. So a lot of people come to AIP with some pretty serious digestive problems, whether or not they know that they're serious. Things like I've worked with people that have had 7 bowel movements a month. That's not normal. And then they do AIP and they start eliminating every day and they go, well, my symptom, my joint pain isn't gone, but I'm going to the bathroom every day. That's actually a really good change. And then if you start to reintroduce foods and then they get backed up again, then you know that food is causing constipation. So sometimes it takes a little detective work and thinking you might not be connecting that symptom with food, but anything digestive, heartburn, GERD, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, alternating stomach aches, those kind of things. Skin changes are huge, and they can range from really serious hives and rashes that are really obvious, even to just redness and flushing, little bumps, hives, that kind of thing. Skin really will tell you, because the gut is skin. The outside of our body, the skin is our largest organ, and it includes our digestive tract. Whatever is going on out here is actually going on in there too. So it's a really good reflector. When our skin looks really good, when it looks bright, when it looks hydrated, it usually means that our digestive tract is also happier. So we want to look for changes in skin, better or worse, right? Mood changes and sleep disturbances are also things people can be on the lookout for. Things like fatigue, joint pain. I'm trying to think if I'm missing any else you might remember.
Well, it's funny because I had GI issues, leaky gut, and that's how I discovered my gluten intolerance. And years after healing my gut, I decided I was going to try a couple bites of food that have flour on it. And my symptom was a total hangover for 24 hours. And that was not my symptoms before, but it was kind of hard, even though I was a health coach, to connect the dots. I was like, what the heck is going on? I didn't drink any alcohol, but I feel dreadfully hungover. I literally can't think straight. Can't do any work.
Yeah, brain fog.
Yeah.
So brain fog is a good one. And I think a lot of people, especially with hypothyroidism, don't even know what brain fog feels like until they don't have it anymore. And then they're like, oh my gosh, I was operating in this all the time.
Yes.
I had nightshade. I tolerate some nightshades, but I had some tomato at a restaurant like a couple weeks ago. And when I ordered it, they said it was cherry based. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll try it. I can do some hot peppers, like spicy peppers, but I can't do tomatoes. And then when it came, there were chunks of tomato after I had eaten some. I noticed some in the sauce and I kind of went, I'm not going to eat any more of that. But I didn't sleep that night. I literally laid in bed and I don't think I slept 1 minute that whole night. And I trend towards having sleep problems, but like I never don't sleep the whole night. And I knew that it was from that. And so, sometimes like sleep disturbances, mood, a lot of times when I've been exposed to gluten, the first thing that I notice, or actually my husband notices, is just that I get really irritable and irrational. Yeah. And I can't control my emotions. So I might be like, once I was cooking a pork chop, and it steamed instead of searing. I didn't have the temperature right. And I just sat down on the ground and I let the pork chop burn and I just cried. And my husband was like, oh, I think that restaurant we ate at. And like, he was right, but normally, I don't know, when I think about like my mental health before I was diagnosed, I would have a lot of situations like that where I just could not cope with things that should have been within my ability to cope. And it is totally related to food. So, if that happens
it
to
reminds
you,
me, just hearing you say that is like, the coffee thing. I heard that you were drinking like 6 cups of coffee when you were trying to figure out what the heck was going on with your health before you were diagnosed. And coffee is one of the things that you eliminate on the autoimmune protocol elimination phase. And for me, I have given up coffee like a handful of times. And now it's been a long time since I've, been drinking it regularly because it makes me stressed out more easily, makes me more emotional. And it doesn't give me the obvious effects like I'm jittery or I can't sleep. It's not like that. For me, it just makes me more irrational or irritable. And I didn't realize it until I gave it up enough times, But what was that like for you to have to give up coffee and do you drink it anymore?
So I have a long history of coffee because I used to be a barista in Seattle. And when I was before I was sick, I had a thing with coffee where I was drinking like 16 shots of espresso a day. I feel really bad admitting that, but I could only achieve that because I was the one dealing the drugs every day. So I was serving it to myself. I had to be at work at 4:30 and I just like was up at the crack of dawn. No, way before dawn, actually. I was like halfway done with my work day when the sun came up. But I had so much coffee and I needed it so bad that I would get off work at 10:30 a.m. and then go home, take a like 2 or 3 hour nap. And then I lived walking distance from where I worked and I would go back to work and I would make myself another quad shot espresso and have that because I couldn't get through my day. I was so addicted. And one day I had my afternoon coffee and I threw up. Like I got that really sweaty, jittery. I'd never got that before. And I got really sweaty and jittery and I just threw up. And then the next day I woke up in the morning and I had my coffee and I threw up. And I was like, I think my body doesn't want the caffeine anymore. But then I started getting the like headache and the hangover. So that was a whole thing. That happened to me like a year before my whole health crisis, where I figured out that I needed to wean off coffee and I couldn't totally ditch it. I went down to like maybe 4 shots a day from 16, but I was in this like catch 22, like I need to wean off the coffee, but then the weaning symptoms were so bad that I was like basically dripping myself like half decaf, taking a sip every 20 minutes. Like it was bad. I'm embarrassed to admit how bad it was.
No.
So by the time I did AIP, I was pretty well off coffee. I might have been drinking like a cup a day. So it wasn't that hard for me. And then I was off coffee for maybe like 5 years. But now in the last couple years, I've been bringing it back. And what I do is I get Swiss water processed decaf coffee.
Me too.
And I put like, maybe a quarter of it is regular beans and 3/4 is decaf because I like the ritual. I'm having a really hard time. I did it for 5 years. So I guess I have a lot of experience overriding that and finding other things. Like I would drink broth and lemon water and different things in the morning. but there's something about it.
Yeah, girl, I'm with you. I mean, you have an awesome like dandelion root, chicory coffee substitute in your book, and that's what I tried too when I gave up coffee completely. Now I'm drinking the Swiss water decaf, but even if I drink that after 4 p.m., I notice I'm tossing and turning in the middle of the night.
Yeah,
And
it
so
still
it's
has
crazy.
caffeine. So that's
Right.
the thing to know is that the chemically processed decafs don't have any caffeine. I'm actually sensitive to the caffeine, not the coffee. So that's important for people to understand. Some people are actually sensitive to the coffee bean itself and
Mm-hmm.
the like chemical effect that it's having in their system. Other people are sensitive to caffeine and what that does to their adrenals. And for especially people with hypothyroidism or any kind of like thyroid disorder or adrenal disorder, I mean, caffeine is just going to kind of like amp up that process in a different way. So for me, that's where I think I can get into trouble with it. But right
Mm-hmm.
now, I'm doing no caffeine until September. So
Cool. So you've just reached this like intuitive sort of place where you've made enough mistakes, you've learned the hard way, and you've made enough exceptions to where now you see like where you can play around with it depending on what's going on in your life, right?
totally. Exactly. And you know, like right now I'm not drinking a lot of coffee or I'm not drinking any coffee. I decreased for a while just because I noticed that my sleep isn't great. And when my sleep's not great, I'm like, okay, what are all the things that I'm going to do? And because I have that tool in my toolbox of like understanding how something affects me and then be knowing that I can just remove it for a while and see how I feel. And also it's a summer. So the ritual
Yeah.
thing isn't as pulling to me. I was kind of like in July, like, why am I making coffee every morning? It's hot. I don't even really want to drink it. And then so adding it up and that's what everyone with a chronic illness should really learn how to do to navigate the rest of their lives is just realize that all these choices that we make every day, they're totally within our power to continue making them or to ditch them or to put them aside for a while or whatever, you know,
Yeah.
and bring something in like, you know, I just defrosted some pate and was like, I'm gonna go for that for my energy needs because it's nutrient dense. That's actually fueling me. It's not fake.
Yeah, so let's talk about nutrient density because that's what your whole book is about now. And I got a quote from your book that says the term nutrient density refers to the amount of nutrients a food contains relative to the calories or the energy it provides. And it might surprise you how difficult it is to get enough nutrients in the modern diet because our food system is flooded with nutrient poor, high energy foods that fill us up but offer close to nothing in the way of true nourishment. And it really resonates with me because nutrient density has always been important to me. I think we're a couple of nerds because a lot of people really don't care about that, but you probably learned the hard way seeing so many people do the AIP diet and not getting the results that they were capable of.
Yeah, you know, nutrient density in the very beginning was such a important factor of AIP because a lot of the researchers like Sarah Ballantyne who are writing about it were really true to the concept of nutrient density and why it was important for people with autoimmune disease, where our bodies are destroying themselves. Like my body is attacking my thyroid tissue and my small intestine. Other people, like someone with RA, their body is destroying their joints. That means that their body is having to also repair them constantly. So when you have like hair loss and dry skin and all of these things that come with autoimmune disease, those are structural things. Like your skin needs nutrients in order to regenerate itself. You need nutrients in order to grow that hair or make those hormones. And where is that coming from? So in the very beginning, it was easier in a way because there weren't, I mean, paleo wasn't a thing yet as big as it is and or it has been. Um, and there weren't like epic bars. There weren't so many alternative baking flours. There weren't like freezer delivery meal companies. There weren't restaurants that had AIP food on the menu. You had to buy
Mm-hmm.
meat and vegetables and cook it and eat it in
Mm-hmm.
order to do AIP. And we talk about it a little bit like, oh yeah, it was the good old days, but in some ways it was easier because it was there was less temptation to make all of these like carby sweet treats that
alternatives.
were
Yeah.
technically AIP, but actually not very nutrient dense. So a lot of people in the community were eating like the seafood and the shellfish and really incorporating tons of bone broth and fermenting their own food. And I didn't know anyone that wasn't doing that, you know?
Wow.
So I wrote this book because I feel like that has gotten lost. The concept of nutrient density has gotten lost in this explosion of paleo and the explosion of AIP. And, you know, I'm not criticizing any bloggers for writing cake recipes. I mean, I have a few in my book. Like, I think they're really important to be able to celebrate with the people that we love and to be able to enjoy something now and again. But educating people about where the line is and that boundary, I think is kind of tricky. So that's what I'm trying to do with the book is just kind of show people that nutrient density is actually a foundation of any way of eating. It's important to anyone, whether, you know, you're raising children or whether you have a chronic illness or whether you're aging, whether you're pregnant. You know, nourishing our bodies is never something that we shouldn't take importance, and the way that our food system is designed, you know, we've been designed to think that calories are the only thing that's important. When you flip over any nutrition fact on a packaged product, calories are at the very top. They're the biggest font. And we're taught that if something is low calorie, you know, that's going to help us manage our weight, but we're not actually looking at the other factors, like the actual nutrients that that food offers. And I would even say there are things that we don't put on those nutrition facts that you can't even quantify, like phytonutrients. You know, fiber is just lumped into one thing. It's not even talking about like what kind of fiber it is. You know, people think they have to get their fiber from whole grain products when they don't understand that fibers are plentiful in vegetables, you know, fruits and vegetables and things like that. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. I mean, your book really makes it clear that foods have a huge range of nutrient density. And you list some of our favorite foods on a chart, this nutrient source table that you created, which is awesome, by the way. But it shows you, you know, by each nutrient, which foods are in that category. And then you see things like liver, for instance, who most people want to gag just hearing the sound of the word liver in the diet. But you see that's like by every single nutrient on the chart. You see something like sardines, it's by every single nutrient that's on the chart. And that is super eye-opening, because if you can get a couple of those in the rotation every week, then all of a sudden you notice your cravings are going down, you're so much more satisfied with your meals, and your palate starts to mature too. You start appreciating those foods a lot more. And I bet that's kind of a challenge for a lot of people, depending what diet they came from. I mean, bone broth is kind of an easy one. If you can get them making it, they love the taste of it. But some of those other nutrient-dense foods are not as easy. Let's talk about the most welcomed nutrient-dense foods that you wish people realized, you know, make such a great foundation for the diet.
Well, okay. So, you know, there are some special foods that are really seasonal that I think are approachable for most people to think about. And there are foods that most people like, but I think that they just think of getting them whenever they're available or whenever it happens, instead of understanding how nutrient density works in like a plant cycle. So things like berries. I live in the Pacific Northwest. We have a great berry season in early summer. And those berries actually are going to have the highest nutrient density in the peak of their ripening season in the area that they're supposed to grow. So we have all these ways of kind of tricking our plants in order to go ripe at the wrong time of year so that they can be on grocery store shelves year round. And this is fine. It's still food, but if you're eating for nutrient density and you really want that peak flavor, because the flavor is actually going to it's telling your body that there's actually some nutrition there, buying things that are actually in season is really important. So things like that we do is we go to You Pick Berry Farms like in June, and we will pick as many blueberries, blackberries, raspberries as we can, to the point where I think we did about 100 pounds this year.
Whoa.
My husband and I, yeah, because he's a big smoothie guy. I don't do a lot of smoothies because they don't work as well for me and my digestion, but they work great for him, and he makes a lot of smoothies. So we pick all our own berries, we freeze them in the deep freeze, and then that nutrition is preserved, right? It from the peak of the growing season from our area, and so whatever you have in your area, some places like around here, basil doesn't grow great. It grows great maybe 2 weeks out of the year. So those 2 weeks I buy a ton of basil and I'll make pesto and I'll freeze that. But maybe you live in an area like the Midwest where, like the basil is going to be really abundant and amazing. It's going to have the highest phytonutrients. It's going to have the best flavor. Buy tons of it in the summer and then, make a pesto. I have lots of recipes. And then I like to freeze them in really tiny, mason jars and then put a little cap of olive oil on top. And then in November or December, when like the produce is pretty slim, you pop out those little cubes of pesto and you can throw them in your meals. And it's like having that nutrient density of summer year round. So just thinking about some of the more pungent, stronger flavored fruits, vegetables, colorful herbs, and when they're most in season, when you can get your hands on them, when to incorporate them into your diet, that is the most accessible place to start with nutrient density.
I love that. And also just hearing you talk about berries, I've seen in the grocery store in the freezer section wild blueberries now. Anything that's wild or heirloom usually is going to have even more nutrient density, right?
Yep.
Cool.
So wild plants have to defend themselves from the environment. They're not cultivated, and cultivation, it helps us keep food on the table year round, but it actually deprives the plant of the suffering that it needs to go through in order to produce all of those phytonutrients and nutrients. So wild plants are some of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. So if people are super geeky, they want to get into foraging, things like dandelion. I mean, a lot of these things are on grocery store shelves now, even things like dandelion and nettles and purslane and things like that. So,
okay, let's talk about nutrient dense animal products. Because even when you're in the elimination phases of the autoimmune protocol, you can have pasture-raised meats and wild-caught seafood. Which ones are the most nutrient dense, and how drastically does it differ from the cheapest stuff you can get at the grocery store?
Yeah, so the most nutrient dense protein sources are going to be cold water fatty fish and shellfish. This is because the cold water fatty fish, they have lots of omega-3 fats. Those are like I would even venture to say medicinal for people with autoimmune disease beyond even nutrient dense, because of how high our diets in the past, most of them have been really high in omega-6, which are really pro-inflammatory. And then people with autoimmune disease tend to have a ton of inflammation. So those cold water fatty fish, things like salmon, I think are really popular with people, but that's actually one of the more expensive ways to get this in your diet. I argue for things like sardines, mackerel, and anchovies, especially the sardines and the anchovies are so small that they're super sustainable. And they also have less mercury because they're small fish. So mercury is cumulative. So when the small fish get eaten by bigger fish, the bigger fish you eat actually inherits all of the mercury content from the fish that it's eaten. So the smaller you eat on the food chain, the less mercury it's going to have. So I really recommend people, try some sardines. I know they're not that exciting, but they're actually really flavorful and really affordable and super nutrient dense. Like they have everything going for them. I always joke around and say they need a new marketing person.
Yeah.
Because like the word's out on salmon, but it's also just like the price is up and not everyone can afford that. So I would start by thinking about seafood. People really do not eat enough seafood in this country. Beyond that, the most affordable protein is going to be grass-fed beef. The demand has gone up. And so now the price is coming down, and there are even a lot of big box stores like Costco that are selling bulk like grass-fed ground beef that can be a really good source. having pastured meat is important because nutrient density is impacted by what the animal ate, not just what the animal is. Pork is actually the animal that has the widest spectrum of like healthy to unhealthy based on what it ate. So I referenced a great study in my book where they took a bunch of hogs from the same farm and they fed them, half of them conventional like grain, and then half of them they let them forage in the pasture. And then they analyzed the meat at the same university, and they found that the omega-3 ratio on the conventional fed pork was 30-1, which is like mimicking our standard American diet. And then the ratio on the forage ones was 4-1, which is like, if you guys know anything about like chemistry, just that potential is just shocking. So it's not that meat is healthy or unhealthy, it's the quality and what the animal ate. So when we're talking about meat, you just really have to dig into where the meat's coming from and how that farmer is actually raising that animal, which can be a little bit tricky to source, but it's getting easier every day with more people that want this, you know?
Yeah, I used to think it was crazy to source your meat from a farmer. I was like, what? I lived in Chicago. I was like, a farmer? I don't know a single farmer. What are you talking about? But now you can go to a farmer's market and you can meet them right there and order the meat at the actual farmer's market. They'll bring their chest freezer and sell it to you right on the spot. But also, everyone knows that's been listening to this show, I love ordering from Seven Sons Farms at sevensons.net. I'll put in the show notes too a $10 off link because you can order from Midwest and almost any state surrounding Illinois. You can order from local farms and 100% pasture raised and on organic land. These are regenerative farmers. So what they're doing with the way they raise the animals is not only beneficial to the animal's health, it's beneficial to anyone who eats the meat from those animals, and it's beneficial to the earth. And so this is all really important. Nowadays, you're hearing people saying you shouldn't eat meat because you want to protect the environment. But regenerative farming is the real natural way to mimic the way animals lived throughout nature, and the earth was designed for that. So it actually gives back. And so the beauty of this is not only that you're feeding your body the nutrients it needs to heal, but you are also helping the environment and you're supporting a local farmer that's really trying hard to do things the right way, which honestly the system is not set up for. So if you don't live in the Midwest, there's also grasslandbeef.com. It's U.S. Wellness Meats. There's plenty of places now where you can get 100% grass-fed because that stuff in the store, you can't always be sure what you're getting. They'll be, raised on grass, but then finished on grain, which does really affect the nutrient profile. So it's not to say it's bad, baby steps. We don't expect you to be perfect, but it makes a difference. And you'll learn all that in her cookbook, The Nutrient-Dense Kitchen. There's plenty in there for everyone because not only are all your recipes AIP compliant, but you also marked which ones are coconut-free, low-carb, low FODMAP. We talked a little bit about low FODMAP on those early episodes where we introduced the elimination diets to you guys because even I had to go low FODMAP for a while. That can be no fun. But with a book like yours, you give us recipes that seem impossible on the elimination AIP portion. Like you have a coffee substitute recipe, you have a chicken pot pie, and you have chili, which is like, hello, everything that's in chili is tomato based and you can't have tomatoes because they're nightshades. And you have a beef pho that's made instead of with noodles, you use zucchini noodles. And you figured out spice blends that you can use even if you're eliminating seeds on the Autoimmune Protocol. It's incredible. What's your favorite couple of recipes that you want to have everyone check out in there?
Oh gosh. That's always a really hard question because I thoroughly love making all this food over and over. The one that I made last night was the shepherd's pie. So I'm a big fan of batch cooking and recipes that I can make a ton at once and then stash in my fridge so that I have food for the week. So the shepherd's pie is great and it's an easy one to make to freeze in jars. So I make about 10 servings and it's just like a nice spiced meat mixture with some veggies and then mashed parsnips and white sweet potatoes on top. So that's a good one. The pâtés are great. There's a chicken liver and a beef liver. I also had that for breakfast that I pulled out of the freezer. And, this food, I eat it all the time. I'm not one of those cookbook authors that I'm just like coming up with some new recipes and I'm like, I'm just going to keep coming up with new stuff. I like, this stuff is on repeat in my kitchen all the time.
Oh, good. Good to know. I tried your lamb, by the way, your lamb chops. I tried those marinated in coconut yogurt. They were awesome. And they have ginger and turmeric in them. And my husband was like, oh, I don't know, because I don't really like ginger or turmeric. He likes them, but it's like, it's hit or miss. You got to get the balance right. And the balance was right. And I had plenty of garlic in there. It was awesome.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think that when I was trying to write the book, I wanted the people, like the auxiliary people in people's lives, to not feel like they were also suffering through someone being on AIP. So if someone threw like a party or had someone over for dinner, or their spouse or their kids, not to be like, oh my God, what are you doing? This food is like really terrible. Everyone can enjoy it. And I feed this food to my family members who have nothing to do with AIP or dietary changes, and they love most of it, I would say.
Great. That's awesome. Hearing you talk about some of your favorite foods, they're mine too, like sardines and pate, but I know a lot of people just have their mind made up and they don't like them. So do you have any things that you want to talk about supplementation? Because I know you have a section in your book talking about that, and things like cod liver oil or desiccated liver capsules are trending really a lot in this nutrient density sort of field. How do you feel about someone supplementing omega-3s or cod liver oil, for instance?
So first, I like to have people analyze their budget for food and supplements and kind of combine them, think of them as one. That's what I do for myself personally. And I like to think about getting my nutrition from food before I get it from supplements. So I'm not anti-supplement. I understand that there is definitely a therapeutic role for supplements, but I like to think, how can I get this in my diet before I start trying to get it through supplements? Because I found that, if I take a certain amount of fish oil, or I prioritize like a supplement that I want really a high quality, cold pressed, nutrient dense fish oil that has to be shipped, refrigerated, and taken every single day. When I take all of that cost into effect, and then I think like how much like wild caught salmon and some frozen wild caught seafood and maybe some Kansas sardines and stuff, like what can I buy with that, or how could that like impact my food budget? I'm always going to find that my food budget is going to be, it's going to get me further nutrient density wise with the same amount of money. Same thing when I think like the beef liver capsules. You have to take so many of them to equal what you can do with actually just making some beef liver and eating a little bit of it every once in a while, that for the people that just have to have the nutrients and can't eat the beef liver, and have the money to do it that way, I think it's fine. But I encourage people to actually try. Beef liver is so cheap. It's like $3 a pound for like the best grass-fed pasture-raised liver. And with my recipes, not to like, oversell them, but like I've converted a lot of people that don't like eating liver, myself included, on these recipes because they have a lot of other flavors. So I use bacon, I use apples, I use tons of herbs, I use onion. I make pate because it's easy to flavor it with other stuff, and the ratio of actual organ meat to all the other stuff going on in the dish is pretty low. So it's really palatable for people that aren't used to eating that or don't like that flavor. But there are other ways people could get organ meats in their diet. So you can freeze liver and then run it through the shredder blade of a food processor, and then put those shredded bits into ice cube trays. And then when those are frozen, put it in a storage container to keep in the freezer. Whenever you have like ground meat, like a burger patty or something, grab a couple cubes of your ground already grated liver and then mix it up with your ground meat. And then you if you do that every time you use ground meat, you're just elevating the nutrient density of that ground meat every time you have it, instead of having to eat like a pate or something. So there are other ways. I would go there before saying I can't eat organ meat, I'm going to do the desiccated. And I'm happy those options are out there for people. I just think the cost benefit is a little bit tricky. So I like people to prioritize food when they can.
Great tips. I've heard about the homemade liver capsules, but not the way you described it. That sounds way better and makes more sense. So thank you. And just hearing you talk about all of this, made me think we should probably just do a quick, off the top of your head, what are names of some autoimmune conditions that people would recognize? They might have someone in their family with an autoimmune condition. Maybe they don't realize it's an autoimmune condition to begin with.
Yeah, well, so at over 100, I'm definitely not going to be able to do a full list, but I can tell you in the AIP community, the most common autoimmune disease is Hashimotos. And then we have a lot of celiac disease, which affects the small intestine, lupus and mixed connective tissue, which affects connective tissue. We have rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, I don't know if I already said MS, multiple sclerosis, psoriasis, a lot of skin autoimmune diseases like lichen sclerosis and lichen planus. There's so many, and those are just like maybe top 10, 15, but a lot of people feel like, gosh, I have this rare autoimmune disease where there are a lot of rare autoimmune diseases, but they're worried that just because they haven't heard of anybody else doing AIP or they don't know anybody else with a disease who's even tried to change their diet, they don't know if it's going to work for them. And the thing that I always tell them is the only thing you're going to lose is potentially your symptoms, your pain, your suffering, right? I mean, in the scheme of illness, living the rest of your life with an illness that is debilitating, what's a couple months and some time and effort? Yes, it's hard, but some people, I've seen a lot of people with really crazy, rare conditions. We have lots of stories on our website if anybody wants to go check that out. People with really rare situations that tried AIP and had a major turnaround, and they never would have done that if they were waiting to hear of someone else with the same rare disease doing it before them. Sometimes you just got to try something and see what happens.
There you go.
You never really know. So that's what I would say to anybody. I don't see my XYZ disease represented in this community. Even if you have an issue where you don't even know if it's autoimmune or not, I don't know, try an elimination diet and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard of people doing the AIP diet for that very reason, because they have something that doctors have not been able to identify or diagnose, and they feel like crap, so they want to try it out. And also, I wanted to know, before we start wrapping up here, does everyone with an autoimmune disease usually have to stay off gluten, or is that one of many things that are exceptions in all different ways?
So, I think it's going to be inevitable that anyone with autoimmune disease that decides to go on a gluten-free diet, you're going to probably be exposed to gluten at some point in your life, and you will, in that moment, find out what your reaction is to it. So as someone I have celiac, I try very hard to not have gluten, but I get exposed to it whether I want to or not sometimes, and I know how I react to it. My opinion is that most people with autoimmune disease should avoid gluten forever. It's just in the research, what it does to the gut, the damage it causes, the leaky gut, the intestinal permeability, and then the cascade of kind of what it can set you up for. And as far as other food reactions, I just think that it's not something anyone with autoimmune disease has any business eating. But I recognize that diet is something that is really individual, and I encourage people not to take anything anybody else says about their journey as fact. They have agency to do whatever they want. And I do know a lot of people who have gluten time to time and say they're fine, and that's okay, Right. So that's what I would say. I think for best chance of success, I would probably avoid gluten forever, but everyone is on their own journey, and I respect that.
Yeah, totally. And it's easier today than it ever was when you and I both started. So at least there's lots of gluten-free options, even at restaurants now. So if you want to learn more about the way that Mickey transforms so many different foods into something the whole family would love, you should check out the Nutrient-Dense Kitchen, and you should go to her website, autoimmunewellness.com. And she's on Instagram at Mickey Trescott and at Autoimmune Paleo. She's on Facebook at Autoimmune Paleo, also called Autoimmune Wellness. And she shares tons of stuff on her pages. You'll definitely want to follow her and grab that cookbook. Is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with before we say goodbye, Mickey?
Just like I would just say be gentle on yourselves if you guys are embarking on any kind of like elimination diet or trying any diet or lifestyle change to improve your health. It's not a linear journey. Sometimes you take one step forward, two steps back. That's totally normal. And so be compassionate and create some space to be gentle on yourself because it's a big undertaking.
Thank you so much for that. We appreciate you and all the hard work you've done. Keep it up, but make sure you get your sleep too.
Thank you so much for having me, Marisa, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. Bye.
It's my pleasure. Bye.